The next thing we want to think about is how we're organizing our ideas and our language. So for this section, we're going to talk about two different things that are very much related. The idea of how we're going to organize your content, and then how we're going to use language as a way to express that completely to the right audience. First, let's kind of review that 5-paragraph essay structure. Now I know this is that structure we've all been taught many times before. So a basic essay is first an introduction with 3 body paragraphs, so each paragraph has its own related topic to the introduction, and a conclusion that restates in a different way what it is that you're going to be expressing to your audience. Now, for our descriptive essay for writing Project 1, the most important thing we want to think about is we're going to be introducing a story. So our introduction is the story itself. This is where you'll narrate. Now, when we talk about narrate, that's that person who kind of gives us the background in a movie or in a book that the characters don't know, so the people in the story don't necessarily know, but we're giving them all of that background information, all the things that we know now, looking back on our memories. And it's a way to define and interpret our story and our experience as to why it's important for us. So for our project, what we want to kind of think about is we have to give all of this information in our introduction that is about the person or the places or the actions that make up the actual story that impacted us. And that defining by giving it a quality, by saying how it's, the sensory details, how they feel, how they smell, how they taste, how they look, what you hear in that moment. So giving us all that detail is really important. And once we get done defining it, we want to start interpreting it. And this is, in a sense, when we think about what interpretation means, it is providing a meaning for something that isn't easily understood. So when you think about what an interpreter does when they're interpreting for different languages, what they're doing is they're not word for word translating what is being said. If they were to do that, it might not make sense completely. So an interpreter has an extra level of skill in that they understand what one person is saying and then telling the other that doesn't understand that what it means and what, that kind of language essentially means in the other language. So it's not a direct translation. So we can't expect people to kind of figure out the meaning completely. We have to show it to them. And that interpretation then leads us to themes, which are body paragraphs, essentially. So, and that might be the first question that we ask is, what are the important things that my story is telling me? So you want to look back to your story and say, okay, what are some important themes? And think about the big main ideas about what the influence was or what the impact was or why something is important. And you might have one theme, you might have 2 themes, you might have 3 themes. You might even have up to 6, but that would be a very long paper and not necessarily one you want to do right now. And finally, we have that conclusion. It helps provide understanding and makes connections between each of the body paragraphs that are our themes or follow-up questions. So we want to kind of think of this as a whole process and how the question cycle is actually doing this process. So the phenomenon is the introduction. The analytical question are the themes that we come up with that lead us to our body paragraphs. The follow-up questions allow us to create even more body paragraphs. And the application back to main idea or claim is our conclusion. It's tying it back into that main idea. Another way to look at this is how we're going to build the outline for your project. So you can also outline your projects kind of in the same way. So we have our story, the original story that you wrote, and now we want to kind of identify those themes. Now again, you don't have to have 4 themes. This is just kind of an example. You might have one really big theme and then ask a lot of follow-up questions, for example. So you want to think of the story as your intro. You want to think of your themes as sections of your paper, for example. And you want to think of the follow-up questions as your body paragraphs. So for every question you ask about your theme, you're going to ask at least one follow-up question. And so this will create a paragraph for your essay. So your story might be 100 words. Then introducing each of your themes might be another 10 to 15 words. And then you have to think about this. It's at least another 100 words for each of your paragraphs here. So each of these paragraphs that you're creating then are the body paragraphs of your paper. Now you'll notice this is very different from the 5-paragraph essay structure. But what it does is it shows you that that 5-paragraph essay structure is still buried in here. It's still the foundation of what you're doing. But now you get to get a little bit more creative, have a little bit more freedom with how you're building the actual outline for your project. So for stage 2, what you're going to be doing is thinking up these questions and creating a question outline. So I don't want you to necessarily give me main ideas. I want you to give me questions instead. So this is what's going to kind of build up your stage 2 draft. Now, the important thing we need to think about is how we word the questions, because those are also going to determine how we express and what we express in those body paragraphs. So let's move on to that idea of organizing your language. Now remember, the way you write very much depends on the context. So I particularly like the way that this image shows the dialog boxes, each having their own different shape, because you want to kind of think about those spaces and places where you have to kind of change the formality, change the tone, change the tenor of your language. And that's going to shape the words you use, the length of your sentences, and how you express your story and your analysis of your story. So here's what we want to kind of think about in terms of the idea of what to do in different contexts. So think of language, formality, and style as a spectrum. So when we use formal and informal writing, there's going to be different spaces and different places to do that. A formal writing style is not necessarily a better style. So both serve their own specific purposes. So it depends on who you're talking to. It might even depend on the personality of the person you're speaking to, or the personality of a particular company or group. Take a lot of care when you're choosing which style to use in which case. So sometimes it means you have to get to know who your audience is, who it is you're writing to and for. So oftentimes writing for professional purposes or academic purposes is a very formal style. So individual communications that can use informal style are once you establish some sort of relationship or become familiar with who it is that you're speaking to. So like a lot of times you might have noticed if you work with clients or customers on the phone is that your communication started out very formal and very kind of rigid. There was no kind of room for different changes. There was a format that you followed. But as you've worked with that client or with that customer more and more often, it becomes more familiar, and it is something where you're able to speak with them as you would speak to a friend. But that might take a lot of time. So emails tend to be a lot less formal than any kind of paper-based communications. So that's because emails are, while they're still a professional genre, they're not necessarily a legal or a business genre that requires you to be extremely formal. But I would still avoid using text talk, so no abbreviations, no emojis, none of those sorts of things that are meant to be very personal. If you're ever in doubt, it's usually better to be more formal rather than informal. This way, you're not assuming any kind of close relationship. It's not a space where you're more likely to offend if you use formal language. So this is where we have to start using our judgment. Now, when we talk about that spectrum, everything is going to be somewhere along that spectrum. So it ranges from formal, which is, highly academic language, even more than just regular academic language, but very formal, very advanced vocabulary, complex sentences. The length and the way that you explain things has a very specific style that you have to follow. And so you want to spend a lot of time learning the rules when there's formal language in use. As we kind of go down the spectrum with academic, there's a little bit more wiggle room. So as you're learning to do academic writing, we're expecting you to learn more and more advanced vocabulary, but we don't expect you to use the most advanced vocabulary. And sometimes it is better to keep your ideas a little bit more simple. We call this the idea of mystifying versus demystifying language. And what that essentially means is very formal language and highly academic language oftentimes are using that high vocabulary and that very high level language usage as a way of testing the reader to see if they are part of that professional group. So it's kind of, you have to be able to understand that vocabulary to participate in that writing and in that reading of those texts. Now, when we get into the semi-formal, this is where it's usually a mixed audience, where you have some professional, some academic, but something that we also call laypersons, who are not necessarily professionals, but they share a set of knowledge with the academics and with those formal researchers and those formal writers. So the audience is a little bit more mixed. We also want to think about the idea of balancing your formality, something that's somewhere in between academic and casual. Now, this is writing that you'll oftentimes see in magazines where there is some advanced vocabulary, there's less kind of this idea of rigidity in relationships, and you're able to do something that's a little bit more conversational, but still has kind of advanced vocabulary. As we move back down the spectrum of casual and informal and into familiar, this is where it becomes very specific instead of to the topic, to the people. So casual, it's when you learn who they are and you're able to establish a relationship and you have that rapport or that familiarity with the person. And so you get a little bit more knowledge about who they are and how to interact with them. We also want to think about language for clarity. And these three different ideas are what help us choose for clarity. So impact, so it's this space where we're trying to think about how our ideas are best received by the reader. So when we think about impact, it's like we want to see something that has the right level of complexity. So oftentimes that might be choosing to state very complex ideas very simply. Oftentimes students feel like to be a perfect academic writer, they have to have highly advanced vocabulary. Oftentimes it's better to be clear and concise and be able to be understood by your reader than to use vocabulary that is unnatural to you or unnatural to your reader. Essentially, you want to think about what language will help your reader connect with your main idea or ideas. The third thing we want to kind of think about, the second thing you want to think about is positioning. Those defining features. We have to figure out a way to show our reader what you mean because they may not know your context. They may not have had your experiences. They may not know where you developed your idea or how you developed your idea. So you have to think about ways of making the reader see what's in your head. So oftentimes, especially in a narrative, we have to give setting. So the sights, the sounds, the smells, the characters, and describe things very carefully. We want to define what it is that we mean. So when we're talking about ideas, it goes beyond those sensory details. And we have to kind of think about examples. So oftentimes we think of like fairy tales or fables or even parables from our different religions. They go and they give example stories to show us the moral of the story. They're defining the features for us in that way, and they're defining the ideas. That means they're making our ideas accessible. So we want to make sure that the way that we talk about our topic is worded in a way that your audience can understand. Make what is complex more understandable. And last, we want to think about the strength of our language to offer clarity. There's a concept called economy of speech. Use the words that you need. So when we make things overly complicated, when we're trying to say something in a very complex way, it might not be the best way. It might actually weaken what you're trying to do with your writing. So finding the best, simplest, most straightforward way to say things sometimes is the best. And I often caution my students about using a thesaurus. Use it very sparingly. It's great for academic language, but use the words that you have already learned. It's one of the reasons that I ask you guys to use defining our content is I'm asking you guys to learn advanced vocabulary, but at the same time, I don't want you to have to worry about what it means to actually use words and vocabulary that you haven't used before if you're not comfortable with it. And that's the whole idea. If you're not comfortable with it, it may be that your reader isn't comfortable with what it is that you're trying to use from your thesaurus any more than you are. All right. So just to real quick, we will kind of recap a little bit. We want to think about how we framed our stories. We want to think about what sort of language we should use. Okay, so what formality? How does it fit along that spectrum? And we also want to kind of think about the problem areas that students sometimes have with descriptive analysis. When it's personal, students have a really hard time because they think academic writing can't use I statements. And the truth is you can. It can still be academic, especially if you're being asked to write a narrative. But just avoid statements like I believe, I think, or my opinion is. Because if you're writing it, that's already implied. So if you're saying a sentence like, I believe that my grandfather was a huge influence on my life. Okay, we know you believe that. All you have to say is instead of I believe my grandfather was a great influence would be my grandfather was a great influence. So take that, whenever you see those phrases at the beginning of your sentences, think about how you might take those out, and it will make your sentences even stronger. All right, now for your stage 2 draft, what we want to start to think about is how you're establishing a question outline for that rough draft. You want to start by organizing and identifying the themes from your story. So we've already done a little bit of this work, but you might want to identify 3 big kind of features in the story that you're telling about your influence. When you develop your outline, it can be a traditional outline format or like the mapping technique like the bubbling from the beginning of this video. Your outline should be in the form of 2 to 6 questions for each of the sections of your essay. This is the analytical point of your question cycle. Now, once you have those sets of main questions, think about the follow-up questions that should go with each of those to fully explore the ideas you've identified, and these will become the body paragraphs for your rough draft later on. So once you've gotten some feedback from me and from your group members, you'll finalize your outline. So this will be after you complete your stage 2 draft, and your rough drafts will be due on the 4th by 11:59 p.m.